start with more of a feel-good topic where we get to talk about positive aspects of welfare. And so I'm just going to start with a little bit of terminology just to make sure we're all on the same page. And so when we talk about animal welfare, that's one of the outcomes of the animal care that dairy farmers and animal caretakers provide. So we say animal care, that's all of our practices that we do as inputs. And then what the cattle experience is their welfare. So that's a property of the animals. So to continue with this kind of diagram, I'm now going to flip it from horizontal to vertical to expand on what we mean by animal care and welfare. So again, animal care is the inputs that we as humans provide to the animal. So this can be their housing environments, as well as our management and husbandry practices that we use when we're taking care of the animals, as well as how we directly handle or move the animals around the farm. So all of these things that we as humans do on the input end influence the outcomes that the animals experience. So primarily, I study animal welfare, and then interrelated to that is animal health and well-being, as well as the things that other outcomes that we want. So good growth, good productivity, that can include good reproduction as well. So all of these outcomes range on a spectrum from poor to good. So we can have poor welfare, good welfare, somewhere in between, and same when it comes to health, growth, productivity, these other outcome metrics. So just to continue with some terminology and some framework before we get into examples of what environmental enrichment really is, I just want to review what aspects are important to the welfare that the animal experiences. So this is one of the scientific frameworks for studying animal welfare. And I think it's important to bring this up just to emphasize that studying animal welfare does have science behind it. There are scientific approaches that we can bring more objective and quantitative perspectives to understanding what animals need to experience good welfare outcomes. And so at the top of this Venn diagram, I have health as a shorthand, but it's not just health, it's anything to do with the animal's biological functioning. So when we think about fitness, whether this is reproduction, productivity, health, this is what we mean. So is the animal in a disease-free or injury-free state? Is she productive? Is she growing, et cetera? And so a lot of veterinary science and classical animal science looks at this part of the Venn diagram. And of course, this is really important and essential to animal welfare. But when we're thinking about the animal's experience of quality of life holistically, there are other things we have to consider. And so that brings us to these other parts of the Venn diagram. So if we look over here, affective state is the scientific jargon, but what we mean is how is the animal experiencing? What is her experience of her quality of life? So those experiences can be positive or they can be negative. And this is something that has been scientifically validated for species such as cattle, where we know that they are capable of experiencing negative emotions such as pain, fear, and stress. And those are negative states that we want to minimize or avoid. And on the flip side, we want to promote these positive experiences. So we're not projecting our human experiences onto cows and saying, oh, are they happy in the way that we as humans are? But we recognize that the opposite of these negative feelings are positive ones, and these have an evolutionary purpose too. So animals can seek out things that give them pleasure or comfort or contentment. So we're keeping it simple here, but this is something that we're able to validate in scientific settings. So one of the things that can affect how a cow feels is, of course, her health status and her biological functioning. But there's this other last part of the Venn diagram that I labeled with behavior. And this is where it's really important to think about the evolutionary history or natural history of a species. So again, we're not trying to project onto cows the things that we as humans think are important, or even things that we know are important for dogs or cats. We study cattle specifically to know what's relevant to their species and what kinds of behaviors are important to them to be able to perform as part of their evolutionary history. So that brings us to the topic of the talk today, because when we talk about environmental enrichment, this is really a key piece of the puzzle, but actually enrichment can affect all of these different aspects of welfare. So depending on what species you're talking about, what type of enrichment, there are benefits that have been shown to the animal's health if they are provided with appropriate enrichments. And importantly, this helps also with this part of the Venn diagram. So what is the animal's subjective experience? It can improve their ability to cope with stress. So reduces those negative feelings around stress. It can also reduce negative feelings around frustration, which is tied to their ability to express these important behaviors. And so on the flip side, this can lead to more positive emotional states or positive quality of life. And so that's what I mean today. It's more of a feel-good topic because we're not just talking about removing abject suffering and pain and those kind of sort of depressing things to talk about, but more promoting these positive states and allowing the animals to do things that are important to them. So that's this last link here, is that when we talk about providing enrichment, from the animal's perspective, we're allowing them to perform behaviors that are important to their species and their life stage. So these needs can be a little different for calves versus for adult lactating cows, but these are behaviors that are important for them to perform if you look at their evolutionary context. So from a more practical perspective, we talked about how enrichment can, in broad strokes, be important for the animal and their own welfare. So why should we as people then care about providing enrichment to be able to accomplish these things? And so I think a lot of times within the industry, when we want to know, what does this mean for the bottom line? If I provide environmental enrichment, is this going to increase profits either by reducing costs or by increasing production? And so I've listed these here. Can we reduce cost to production associated with animals experiencing stress or negative health? Can we improve their health by providing enrichment? Can we overcome some reproductive issues, or can we increase production, again, affecting on the balance, the profits? And so I think that's where the evidence is a bit mixed. Again, it depends on what species you're talking about, what type of enrichment. There is some limited evidence that providing enrichments can address these different parts of the profit equation, but there are other arguments as well. So one is an ethical argument. So you can directly improve animal welfare by providing enrichment. By definition, if it's an enrichment, it needs to be something that's relevant and important to the animal. And so if we provide them with these things, we can improve their quality of life. And that in and of itself is a good thing. Of course, I can't tell you how important this factor is to you. That's something that we personally have to weigh with our priorities and our own values. And then the last argument is that this could be important for the sustainability of the dairy industry. So even if it might not affect your profits today, investing in enrichments can be a way to demonstrate to the public that you care about these ethical obligations, that you care so much about your animals that you want to go above and beyond and provide these opportunities for them and maintain what's called the social license to operate. So what this means is that in the long run, are people such as direct consumers of dairy products or people who potentially could vote on legislation affecting the ag community, do they feel good about their purchasing decisions based on their values around how the animals are treated? So by providing enrichment, it can help meet some customer expectations, meaning these companies along the supply chain, as well as direct consumer expectations. So I'll give an example of what I mean and how these kind of all tie together. And so the first topic we're going to talk about in more detail, which I'll just touch upon now, is brush use. So here's an example of a Forbes article. It says, do happier cows make for happier consumers? And of course, we're kind of extrapolating that having a cow use a brush would make them happier. And that's, you know, a little bit of a logical leap. But I'll talk in a moment about why we do have evidence that brushes are important for cows. And then here's just a little social media clip from the Huffington Post from a few years back, where they did a little piece about Dr. Nigel Cook's group here at the vet school, the Dairyland Initiative, and they filmed on a local farm here, pretty close to Madison, where they do provide cow brushes. And what you'll notice here is all of these positive social media reactions, a lot of comments and views. And what Dr. Cook said was he was just really amazed at how overwhelmingly positive the responses were when people saw this type of footage. And what he has said is it's really hard to criticize this farm and the dairy industry in general when you see farmers taking actions like this, where you're able to demonstrate how much you care for the animal. So not just the type of animal care. So we're not just talking about housing or how you move the cows and handle them, but you're demonstrating your caring for the animals. And so it makes it harder for consumers to say, or activists to say, oh, dairy farmers are cruel, they don't care about their animals, when you're going out of your way to provide environmental enrichments and opportunities for cows to express these behaviors. I think it creates this very positive message around animal care in the industry that also is very realistic. A lot of farms do these practices now. So this is just an example of what I mean by meeting these expectations, showing that not only is it just good for your bottom line today, but that you really care about your responsibility towards the animals and making sure that they're fulfilled in this holistic manner when it comes to welfare. So I also just want to pause and say, This is just me providing an example of how you could consider these different reasons to implement enrichment. But again, it's not required. I'm not telling you you have to do this to be a good dairy farmer, but it's just some food for thought about the benefits it could provide to your operation. So when we talk about what's expected in the industry today around animal welfare, again, if we return to my earlier diagram where animal welfare is on a spectrum, so an animal can be experiencing poor welfare, good welfare, somewhere in between. A lot of times we really focus on the negative end of that spectrum. And so I'm just pulling a quote from a paper here where if we think about things that can cause poor welfare, so the negative side of that equation, a lack of negative welfare conditions does not necessarily mean that animals are in good welfare and have a good quality of life. It's more that neutral part of the spectrum. So of course we want to avoid animal abuse. We want to avoid chronic pain, such as untreated severe lameness and that sort of thing. But if we take it a step further, if we want to provide the best possible care and really maximize animal welfare, then animals should experience positive conditions, which allow them to live a life that's really worth living. And so this is how we can start shifting the conversation from just eliminating poor welfare conditions to pushing for more positive or good welfare conditions. And so the reason I introduced that is to talk about what the industry-wide expectations are right now, because a lot of people will ask, well, do I have to do this? And the answer is no. For most farms, you don't have to. So when we think about the farm program, which 99% of dairy farms in the US participate in today, enrichment is not something that is required. So it's something that's optional. It's something that people like myself can provide information on and at least spread awareness about, but it's absolutely not required. There is absolutely no mandate that every single farm has to provide brushes or any specific type of enrichment. But if you do participate in specialty labeling schemes, so for example, if you're animal welfare certified through Global Animal Partnership, so if your products go to Whole Foods, then you have to be certified in this way. These types of programs do have expectations around specific kinds of enrichment. So if you have adult cattle or if you raise young stock, they outline specific examples of how you can meet the requirements to get this certification or get this label. So again, it's not required, but because we know that there are benefits for animal welfare, we promote it as a best practice. And at this point, it's optional unless you participate in specific labeling schemes. So again, today is more about just giving you some food for thought. So if you feel like you have room in your operation and in your budget to enhance animal welfare and think about ways to make it more positive rather than neutral, I'm just going to go through some examples now. So across species, whether we're talking about dairy cattle or even animal that aren't on the farm, so we're talking about lab animals, pets, zoo animals, there are some scientific papers classifying different types of environmental enrichment. So these concepts translate across species broadly, but then again, it comes down to what is appropriate for that specific species and the life stage that they're at. But when we talk about enrichment, they can roughly be categorized into 5 different types with a little bit of overlap. So there's sensory enrichment, social enrichment, nutritional, occupational, and physical. So I'm just going to walk through some examples of each type. So the first one is sensory. And so this has to do with the animal's senses. So this can be sight, smell, sound, touch, taste, etc. And so with cattle, one example that I already mentioned that is a sensory enrichment is tactile, and that's through providing brushes. So most commonly, I think when we think about brushes, we're picturing pens of lactating cows where they have these mechanical or automatic rotating brushes. And so here's just one example. Some of them are horizontal, some of them are vertical, some of them sense based on when the cow touches it, others sense when the cow is nearby and they start spinning and rotating and swinging and that sort of thing. And these, I think, have become more and more popular over the last decade. And so I'm just repeating this diagram over here to remind us that when we think about this type of enrichment, it's a sensory enrichment. It provides some tactile feedback to the cow, but it does address these different aspects of welfare. And so oftentimes when I visit a farm that has these brushes, I like to ask the producer, so what motivated you to implement these brushes in the first place? Because these fancy rotating brushes are not free and they're not that cheap. So why did you invest in this? And most commonly people tell me, well, I like having clean cows. Hygiene is really important. We know that's really important for milk quality as well. And it's important for welfare in terms of this top circle here about the animal's bodily function. And then sometimes people will kind of chuckle and say sort of sheepishly, and also, the cows seem to really love it. And I see them lining up to use the brush. And I usually encourage producers to embrace that part because there is scientific evidence behind that, which I'll show you next. And also it really fits into what I described earlier about being able to demonstrate to consumers that you care about the cows and their quality of life and that they do enjoy this type of enrichment. I think that that is a really powerful message to be able to talk about it and say what you're doing for the animals. So there was a study a few years ago that looked at how motivated cows are to gain access to this type of brush. And so motivation testing is a technique that's often used in animal welfare science to try to understand how important is a resource to an animal, or how important is doing a certain kind of behavior to them, so that we can understand what things they need to experience positive welfare. So what I'm showing you here is a graph from that study. It was done in Canada, but then also just a summary. So what they had the cows do was push a gate that was weighted to be able to access the area that had the brush. And so they had a control treatment that was just an empty pen. So cows could push the gate to go into an empty pen. And then they also had the chance to push the gate to access that rotating brush. And that was also compared against accessing some fresh TMR after a couple hours of feed deprivation to make sure that they were a bit hungry. And so what the graph is showing is the proportion of cows that kept pushing that gate for each of these 3 treatments as they increased the amount of weight on the gate. So as it became harder and harder to push that gate, were the cows still so eager to get access to these things that they would continue to push these heavier and heavier weights. So this is called a survival curve. And what it's showing is how many animals were left still pushing at each weight. So what you can see is that cows did push the gate to access an empty pen, and that's why we need this control treatment, but that quickly tapered off. And then they kept pushing for longer and longer, even as this weight increased, if they had the chance to access the fresh feed or the brush. And you can see brush 1, brush 2, because it was repeated a few times. And so the conclusion was that they were equally motivated to access this brush as they were to access fresh feed when they were hungry. And so this showed that the brush was really important to them compared against this gold standard of fresh feed when they were hungry. So what this is demonstrating is, yes, cows really care about having access to this brush. And so if you are a producer who has these brushes and you've noticed that the cows seem really eager to use them, they seem to be enjoying it, that's not just some fuzzy observation. There are data behind it showing that, yes, cows do think that this is a very important resource. It allows them to express natural behaviors to groom themselves. And there are these kinds of products for calves as well. So when we talk about things needing to be relevant to the species and to the life stage, studies have shown that calves also find these brushes to be quite appealing. And I'll talk about this more in a moment, but I understand that for calves, this investment can sometimes be even more difficult to justify since they are not yet productive members of the herd who are producing and bringing in revenue. So there are these products available, but in a moment, I'll show something maybe a little bit more affordable that can be an option for some people. But yes, papers have documented that calves will use these types of rotating brushes as well, even from a very young age. So another option that I think a lot of farms have is these lower cost stationary brushes. So I'm calling them stationary because they're not moving. So they're fixed, and they might have a spring attached like this one at our research farm, where the cow has to do the work to brush herself rather than the brush doing the work to rotate or swing. And I think that this can also be an effective option. There are not studies that directly compare these stationary brushes to the rotating ones, but they are something that cows will take advantage of. And so I think that if cost is a limiting factor for you, that providing these kinds of stationary brushes are a good option to allow cows to express this grooming behavior that is important to them. So again, no studies directly comparing, but I am happy when I see these kinds of resources because I think that they are relevant and they are appealing to the cows. So speaking of this, that's why some work in my lab has explored these types of brushes as a solution for young stock where they're not yet producing and bringing in revenue to the farm. They're just a cost on your balance sheet, but they still have these behavioral needs. We still care about their welfare. And so providing stationary brushes can be an option for them. So we have explored this with weaned heifers because they tend to be an age group that gets a little bit less attention, but there are also other papers that have looked at this type of solution for pre-weaned calves as well. And so in this in these two studies, we just went to the hardware store and we bought deck scrub brushes. And we mounted them in the pens for these weaned heifers. So we did it both in a bedded pack as well as in the mini free stalls. And what we found was that for this age group, the brushes seem to have a dual purpose. So in addition to grooming themselves, primarily on the face, because that's where they would direct most of this behavior, even adult cows, when they have a rotating brush, they're directing a lot of attention to their heads and their necks. So we saw this grooming behavior that we expected, but we also saw this second behavior equally as common, which we called oral manipulation. So it meant licking or chewing the brush. And this made a lot of sense because younger cattle, whether they're pre-weaned calves or growing heifers, tend to have a lot of this oral behavior. So they like to suck on things. They like to manipulate stuff with their tongues. And we think this is part of the developmental process as they're learning to process feed. So if you observe the way cattle graze on pasture, they're actually ripping with their tongues and bringing that food into their mouth. And so we think that this allows them to express the behavior on something that's more appropriate in their environment rather than playing with other things in the pen or sucking on each other. And so I think more work is needed in this area, but we saw some intriguing patterns, and other people have as well with younger calves, where there's this kind of dual purpose. And in a way, this can be an advantage of these simple brushes, because with a rotating brush, they're not able to do this licking and chewing behavior as well. The other thing we looked at in one of these studies was, does it matter to the heifers how these brushes are mounted? So do you need to put them vertically or horizontally? Does it matter how stiff the bristles are? Because some of the companies that make these types of rotating brushes for calves will market that the bristles are softer for calves. And we just wanted to know, does that even matter? Should that be a selling point? And the good news in this case was actually the heifers didn't have a preference. So whether they were mounted vertically or horizontally or had extra stiff bristles or less stiff bristles, they use them equally. And so in that way, it's good news. It means you have a lot of flexibility and a lot of options in how you can implement this type of enrichment. So what I'm showing next is actually part of what was the inspiration for looking at these smaller brushes, which is there is a company that has this freestall system. And so that's actually what they're mainly marketing, but I've noticed that they offer these little rubber brushes, or they call them scratchers, attached to some of the stall hardware. And so when I've chatted with them before, they don't actually talk a lot about the scratchers in their literature. It's just an add-on that kind of comes with the product. But I found that really intriguing. And they said it actually was an inspiration by farmer request. So when they were beta testing the stall hardware, one of the farms was reporting that the cows were scratching a lot on the rubber texture of the freestall hardware. And so they actually asked for an express purpose scratcher to be installed. And so that's why they offer this. But I thought that was really intriguing and could provide just another option for simple enrichment for cattle of all age groups. So I'm not being paid to endorse this product. This is just an example that I think can provide some inspiration for people to be creative and look for low-cost ways to provide some environmental enrichment. So as I mentioned in our previous heifer study, we also did repeat this in a mini freestall setting and not just in the bedded pack. And in this case, my disclaimer is I am not recommending what I'm showing in this picture. So this was an experimental setup. We were trying to see if we could attract newly weaned heifers, weaned heifers into these stalls when they were first exposed to free stalls, because we had some problems with alley lying and backwards lying. So I am not recommending this. This was experimental. And I think instead, if you were to take these cheap scrub brushes and mount them on free stalls, I would put them either on the neck rail or in the loop somewhere more accessible to the animals where they don't have to be lying down in the stall to use them. But again, it's just materials available at your local hardware store. So deck scrub brushes, we have some hose clamps, which are also called worm gears sometimes, and some cable ties. We put some vet wrap to provide some traction. And so this is just, again, inspiration, a way to make it accessible and give you some ideas for how to provide sensory enrichment. Okay, so moving on to the next example. Social enrichment is something that is relevant to species who would naturally live in social groups in the wild. So cattle are definitely herd animals. And so this social contact is something that is important and relevant to them in terms of their natural history. So when we think about our modern dairy industry in the US, typically there's this divide where before weaning, calves are mostly housed individually. So about 3/4 of farms in the US still primarily use individual housing. And then after weaning, that's when they start to move into social groups for the first time. So as heifers and then as adult cows, whether they're lactating or not, they tend to be in some kind of group housing. And so when we think about this younger age group, especially, this is where we have a chance to provide social enrichment by giving them social contact with others of their own kind. So I know that the purpose of this talk is not to focus on pair housing, but I do just want to run through some of the research there. Because this is where we have examples of how providing this social enrichment can address all three aspects of welfare. So first, when we think about the motivation for social contact, so we know that they're a social species. We know that if we house them in same age pairs or groups, this addresses their need to seek contact with others of their kind. So there have been motivation studies, just like the push gate study I described with the brushes, and also preference studies where we look at the fact that calves do prefer to be close together. They do prefer to be in full contact with a peer of a similar age. And then there's also these artificial sort of scientific testing contexts where we can interpret their responses to ambiguity as being optimistic or pessimistic. Basically, are they willing to take a risk? Do they think they're going to get a good reward when they see something ambiguous? And you interpret it as optimistic if they think they're going to get the reward. All this to say, when they're housed in pairs or groups, their responses in these test situations seem to indicate that they have a more positive emotional state, which has to do with this part of the Venn diagram. So reflecting this more optimistic and positive set of feelings. And then just really quick, we know that in terms of their development at this age, that there is the sensitive period where they have the potential to learn a lot from each other. So they learn to literally play with others of their own kind, but also figuratively as well. So they learn about appropriate social interactions and how to communicate and interact with others of their kind. And that's related to these concepts where also in terms of their development, it's not just physical, they also have cognitive development. So they're learning things, and many studies have shown that when calves are housed in pairs or groups, they learn differently and they're more able to adapt to new things and adapt to change. And that change can include weaning, which is always a stressful period, but there's something called stress buffering, where if they're housed in pairs or groups before weaning, they can get through that stressful time and cope a little bit better. But then it also does help with their physical development as well. So when we think about this circle, even though it says health, this also includes other aspects of their biological fitness, including their growth. And so many studies have shown benefits of pairs or small groups in terms of their starter intake and their growth and their weight gains during that period. And so this table is just summarizing the number of studies that have found a specific direction. So these green plus signs mean these studies found that calves housed in pairs or small groups had better growth than those housed individually. And then these gray equal signs means a number of studies didn't detect a difference. So whether they were housed individually or in pairs or groups, they performed equally well. And then over here, what you can see is that no studies have found that pair or group housing led to worse growth. So either there are benefits or it's about the same, but there has never been a detrimental effect in terms of the calves' physical growth if they're housed in pairs or groups. So it's another benefit of this type of enrichment. And then in terms of direct benefits to the calves themselves, I have some preliminary work in my group looking at calves housed in outdoor hutches, where they can be exposed to environmental extremes, both in terms of heat stress and cold stress. And so we hypothesized that in extreme cold in the winter, if the calves are housed in these outdoor hutches, but they have a partner, they can potentially huddle together for warmth and conserve more energy that would be left over for important things like growth and immunity. So again, this yellow part of the Venn diagram. And so we're still working through these results and we hope to have those soon. And then lastly, kind of going back to my message at the beginning, things that are good for the animals often also play well in terms of public perception, because it's a way to demonstrate that you care about animal welfare and that you're doing practices that can enhance welfare. And so really quickly, there was a study at University of Minnesota that found that pair and group housing has the potential to improve public perception. So when they showed people these three photos in a randomized order, so a calf in an individual pen, a paired pen, or a larger group pen, you can see that unfortunately only a third of these respondents approved of individual housing, and almost half of them didn't approve of this. But then that pattern was flipped when they saw the parent group housing. And again, this was in a random order. So now 2/3 of people approved of pair housing, 3/4 approved of group housing, and a much smaller percentage disapproved. So that's just one study, and much more work is needed in this area. But I did just want to highlight these patterns in terms of social enrichment. And if you want to learn more, there's a link right here where I have this series of free fact sheets that you're welcome to access and learn more about this topic. And we can talk about that in more detail another day. So what I want to segue to is when we think about parent group housing, one of the challenges that a lot of producers have brought up to me is that they're interested in some of these benefits I mentioned, but they're really worried about cross-sucking and the potential for blind quarters. And so we do go into more detail, but I just want to segue that this is an example of where nutritional enrichment can help. And so this is another type of enrichment. And so in terms of nutritional enrichment, the example that I'm thinking of is work we did in my lab to try to reduce cross-sucking. And we found that there are a few effective ways that replicate what's been shown in previous research. So one is the way that you feed the milk. If you feed through a nipple, especially one with a slow flow rate, it means that the calves spend more time suckling appropriately, and that relieves their motivation to suckle inappropriately, meaning on each other. And then another method we tested was this nutritional enrichment where we provide the starter grain, but through a Braden bottle. So again, it has a nipple and it allows them to express the natural behavior. So again, more information is found on that fact sheet. I won't go into any more depth, but these are just some examples for calves of how we can provide nutritional enrichment. And so I want to make an analogy just to explain what nutritional enrichment is. It's a way of providing feed that you would normally feed, but in a way that mimics natural feeding behavior more. So an example is if you go to the zoo, there are a lot of nutritional enrichment. So for example, for giraffes, even for carnivores, where you provide food in a way that would mimic the actions and the behaviors that they would use when they're foraging in the wild. And by doing these activities, it allows them to express these important behaviors so that they don't start to do abnormal or inappropriate behaviors, like such as cross-sucking or sucking on other aspects of their environment. And so I think that this can also translate to creative strategies that I've seen in scientific studies that haven't yet really been implemented on farm. So just as another example of that, there's a study that came out recently from UC Davis looking at a form of nutritional enrichment for calves so that they can start to practice processing forage. And so in this example, they put hay inside of a tube feeder inspired by the giraffe enrichment that I just showed you so that calves can practice using these techniques that they would normally use to process feed as they develop into full ruminants. And this might also remind some of you of different types of enrichments that you may use in your own houses. And so an example is these puzzle feeder for dogs. And the reason I didn't put this under nutritional enrichment is because in this case, it's not necessarily mimicking their natural feeding behavior. It's more of a cognitive enrichment or something to give them a challenge or a way to problem solve. And so this falls under the category of occupational enrichment, which is exactly what it sounds like. Keep them occupied, give them something to do, give them a challenge so that they don't end up bored and starting to do problem behaviors. And so again, this can provide them a source of food, but I would consider this more of a cognitive enrichment rather than a nutritional enrichment per se. And so I'm giving an example with pets, I think, first of all, because a lot of people are familiar with this, but also because we don't have a lot of examples of this on the farm. So at this point, it's just an idea and not necessarily something I've seen implemented in the way I've seen social enrichment and sensory enrichment in the form of brushes. And so there is a concept. So for example, when I showed you earlier, these data from the study on brushes, remember that they provided a control treatment, which was an empty pen. And what we saw was that cows would push the gate to go into an empty pen. They could see inside, they knew there was nothing there, but they wanted to push the gate anyway. And I think that this is an example. And I've seen similar results in some of my own work actually with feedlot heifers, where if we provide them a task in a scientific study, even in the control treatment, they'll be doing this kind of work just for its own sake. And so we call this in the animal welfare literature agency, which basically means the animal takes the initiative to just do something so that they can have control over their environment. They're manipulating something, they're problem solving, they're doing something to keep themselves occupied. And so again, this is just totally theoretical right now. We don't really have treat puzzles for cows, but I think that this is something where we could explore more options in the future. And then also under occupational enrichment, there's just exercise. So in addition to exercising their minds, they can exercise their bodies. So if anybody is a horse owner, we know that when you're keeping a horse in a barn, it's nice to be able to turn them out in a paddock or a corral so that they get a chance to stretch their legs and put themselves through the paces and exercise. We know that physical exercise can be really important for an animal to avoid boredom and frustration and some of these negative feelings and allow them to experience this type of enrichment. And this is also the case for cattle. And so the picture I'm showing here is from an experiment that was done in Canada. So I was assisting with training these cows to the electric fence, but they were given the opportunity for this winter turnout on a bark mulch bedded pack. But it shows that even cows, mature lactating Holstein cows, can get out some of that frisky energy if they're given the opportunity to exercise. So this is something that I think is very relevant, and a lot of farms do this seasonally, maybe not in the season shown here, but it allows them to express a lot of natural behaviors. So not just running around, but also resting, using postures where they can spread out more than maybe they can in a stall. And so then the last example here is physical enrichment, meaning manipulating the physical environment to mimic things that they would seek out in their natural environment. So again, there's a lot of overlap here, but what I'm thinking of in this case, calling it physical enrichment, is just providing more different kinds of spaces in the barn. So when we think about a cow who's approaching parturition, we know she undergoes a lot of physiological and behavioral changes. And if you observe cows in naturalistic settings, and this can include beef cow-calf operations or dairy cows housed on pasture, right when they're about to give birth, they separate themselves from the herd. So they're social animals. They usually like to congregate together, but when a cow is about to calve, she will seek seclusion and privacy and isolation. And so we know that that's a natural behavior and something that's important to them through a series of studies that have been done in a more typical indoor housing environment. And so there are ways to provide them with privacy, and these studies have shown that the cows seek that out and they make use of it. And so the example here is a photo taken by Dr. Nordland from the vet school here at Madison, where a farm has implemented some privacy where the calving pens are on this side, and then the more standard home pens are over here. And just by providing this barrier, this way the cows who are calving don't see all the action that's going on and all the busy things that are happening in the day-to-day farm operation, and they have more of this sense of privacy and a sense of calm, and reduces the stress during this already very stressful time. So this is an example of a physical enrichment. So just to wrap it all up, the take-home messages are, first of all, if you provide environmental enrichment, it can improve animal welfare from all different facets. So I'm calling this holistically. There can be benefits to their biological functioning, such as hygiene, when we think about cow brushes, or a reduction in lameness if cows have access to pasture or turnout. And it also addresses these important natural behaviors. I think that's really fundamental to what enrichment is, and that these things combined lead to this more positive welfare state. So rather than just taking a cow from negative, removing any sources of pain and bringing her to neutral, now we're thinking more about positive welfare and good quality of life. And there are lots of different options when it comes to providing enrichment. It can come in a lot of different forms. It can be social enrichment for calves, nutritional for calves or for older animals, sensory such as brushes for any age group, occupational, which can be exercise or some kind of problem solving, as well as physical, such as providing privacy during calving. And if we are able to accomplish this, it's something that's important for the animals themselves, but it is also important to customers along the supply chain, as well as our potential dairy consumers, to help assure them that we truly care about our animals and we really want to do what's best for them. And if we have it within our means, there are a lot of creative ways to apply enrichment in some forms that aren't always that expensive and can mean a lot to the animals. And in this way, I think it is something really beneficial to the farm, because you can send this really positive message around animal care. And I think there aren't enough of those positive conversations nowadays, and this is a way to highlight the positive rather than dwelling on the negative.